2-1. All right, Gary, it's been a minute, but it's good to be back with you, my friend. I hope the holidays have been good to you, and 2025 is right around the corner, so happy early New Year.
Thank you very much, and likewise to you, sir. Hope it was a
Thank you,
good.
sir. It was fantastic, and I'm actually excited to be back here, especially kind of going through your memoir. Where we last left off, it was prior to your official assignment to 2-1. I know that in your memoir, you mentioned that you stood in a very long line of people getting their assignments for what battalion and regiment they would be going to. Were there any regiments or battalions that you had heard about that you did not want to go to due to where they were in country?
No, sir, not at all. And also, just to help us reference through on a separate screen here, I do have the chapters that we're going to be talking about. So if you move along, that sort of thing, I can move with you and um, see if I can pick it up on my end, especially if you
Perfect.
have any question about any of the pictures, things like that.
Well, and I was definitely going to bring up some of the pictures, because one, those are great inserts that you've done there. But I also know that you got your assignment simply to 2-1 because you being from Texas, if I'm not mistaken.
That is correct. And to go back to your first question there, I had no earthly idea of what units were in Vietnam, where they were at, anything of that nature. Certainly wasn't shared with us. And as a ready operator, you could be assigned anywhere, really. So I knew I had a wide range of possibilities. Second question, yes, there's kind of a cute little story that I tell about how I ended up getting assigned to 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, which dealt with a request by the battalion commander of 2-1, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, um, for a radio operator that spoke his language. And it turns out he was from Amarillo, Texas, and I was from Lubbock, and that's about 110 miles difference there. So this long line that you had referenced was actually um, they probably had about 3 or 4 desks set up outside, and each one had a long line in it. So that in itself was a random little thing. I mean, who would know who's in at what line you're in is going to affect where you end up. So I had about a 1 out of 5 chance of getting in the wrong line. And depending on, not having hindsight now, knowing that I got in one of the best units that you could possibly be in with one of the best commanders that you could have. So that's how that kind of came about. The ready operator I was replacing, they wanted him up with the battalion as soon as possible. They were involved in Operation Pegasus, coming up to relieve the 26th Marines at Khe Sanh. And it found out later that one of the ready operators, a kid from Boston, who doesn't speak Texan, had been killed in that period of time, or just before. So that's when they made the dots and connected me to 2-1, and off I go.
Well, and for you, I know the commander that you referred to, the battalion commander, was Lieutenant Colonel Duncan. And with Lieutenant Colonel Duncan and his leadership capabilities and his, I guess in many ways, the demeanor he had as an officer, how would you describe him as a commander?
He was what I'd call a very well-rounded commander. He wasn't necessarily an easy guy. He kind of by the book type of fellow, but that's okay because you know what you were dealing with. Remarkable fellow. He was actually what they sometimes call a bootstrapper. He was a sergeant in Korea and ended up with a battlefield promotion type of thing to first lieutenant. Had done such a good job for that period of time that they convinced him that he should go to officers candidate school. So after Korea, he did go to OCS and graduated and worked his way up through the ranks. So he was a lieutenant colonel when I met him. So he had a very good sense of the enlisted man side of the fence, and he didn't have a big-headed type of "I'm a Marine Corps officer" mentality either.
Well, as an officer, having that prior enlisted experience before going into, of course, OCS and eventually working his way up to a battalion command, that gave him a fundamental understanding of how enlisted NCOs operate at squad level leadership, fire team level leadership, and then all the way up to battalion. So that gives him an edge compared to those who had not worked their way up through the ranks.
He definitely had some advantages. Yeah.
I also understand he had a unique call sign.
All the time that I was there, he was known as Texas Pete. Evidently, the commanders had the option of coming up with their own call signs, and I never asked him about that specifically, but he was definitely Texas Pete. By the way, this is end of December 2024, and he's still with us. Lives in Washington, D.C. area, and we stay in communication with each other.
That's incredible. That's outstanding.
Yeah, it's been a blessing.
Well, and with that being the fact that you eventually form a close relationship as his radio operator, because as the radio operator, you go everywhere that he goes. You are in his back pocket essentially. That way, any reports that come in, you feed it to him, and if he needs to get on the horn, you're right there and available.
To a degree, that's correct. The difference would be that, I was in the communication platoon or the radio platoon, part of the communication um, section. So in that section, you had your wiremen, you had the radio operators, a couple other um, military occupations. So there's probably at the battalion level at any given time, we probably had a good 10 or 12 radio operators. And of course, our main function was with battalions. So we were uh, at Khe Sanh, especially, we had the command bunker, which is really large sized bunker, and our big tall radio antenna mask were set up there, things of that nature. And you would have to man the radios there inside of the command bunker, split shift, 8 hour shift. So you had three shifts a day. So that rotated radio operators. And any operations that were taking place right outside of the wire of our perimeter of the Khe Sanh, quite often, a battalion radio operator would go with, whoever went out for that particular operation. It might be just what they call a wire check to go out, a little bit, check, make sure that from the outside coming in that everything looked like it was supposed to, because it wouldn't be unusual at all for the bad guys to cut their way through the wire slowly and then open up a pathway. So all kinds of different activities would be taking place where radio operators would be assigned battalion wise. So I got to know Colonel Duncan really well because, I would be there in the bunker with him and quite often directly communicating what I was getting from the field, or we even had radio contact with our regimental level back in Da Nang area. So, you can't, you're on an 8 hour shift there, and he was always taking care of things. So we got a good chance to get to know each other better. He did have, there was a sergeant that basically introduced me into 2-1 when I arrived there, and that sergeant was probably his number one guy, just because of the longevity that he had in their working relationship. So I didn't move up into what you might call a comfortable relationship with him until about, a couple months into my tour.
Sir.
And of course, being from Texas, he gave me a hard time about that in a sense, and I gave him a hard time back about it was all his fault, all that kind of good stuff, and just type of guy that we could have that kind of dialogue and stuff. And I think I must have presented myself in such a manner to him that he felt comfortable and whatnot. And down the road, I'll tell you about the story about when we left Khe Sanh, and that's a good example of what you had talked about, where I was his radio operator in that um, pretty historical moment there and stuff. And just to be associated to that with him is an honor.
Well, and bringing back all of this full circle to where this all began, you get the notification, clerk tells you Lieutenant Colonel Duncan's wanting a radio operator that speaks his language. And then you learn that you're going to Khe Sanh. And you'd heard about Khe Sanh prior to your arrival in the country. So what feeling did you have knowing that you were headed to Khe Sanh?
I was scared as shit. You know, um, the only thing I saw about Khe Sanh was the newsreel clips, which, is always, it's not just their day-to-day activity stuff, it's like, the bombs bursting in air type of explosions and things of that nature, and people running around trying to, get to a bunker, things of that nature. Um, had no idea what to expect, just knew it was not going to be pleasant.
And on top of that not so pleasant experience, your orders were to report there as quickly as possible. I mean, and there was no delay. You were instantaneously sent that direction.
Um, the very next morning, I did depart Da Nang. I was directed down to a convoy that was going to be going from Da Nang to Dong Ha, which was roughly about a 6-8 hour trip. And Dong Ha was actually a Vietnamese city, and they had a major base there of operations and a lot of other operations in places like Khe Sanh was around that area. Khe Sanh was about 60 miles, 50 miles or so from Dong Ha. So in hitchhiking my way up to Khe Sanh, I rode up there in this deuce and a half convoy. And those things go really fast and they don't stop for anything because it's common tactic, to try to hit the second vehicle or something like that, cause some area where you have to stop, and then they, just like in the old Western movies where they're up in the hills and you're down in the valley and the Indians are shooting at you from the hills and you don't have any place to run. So convoys is really dangerous stuff. They could booby trap the roads and things of that nature. And if you get around a vehicle that had been hit, you didn't stop to help. You had to just keep moving because that was another part of the tactics of guerrilla warfare.
Well, and two, I know that I've talked to some friends of mine who were Marines that have been on convoys that have been ambushed and going through that protocol. So you are there, you're loaded. Essentially, if something happens, you fight from the truck as it's moving. But if you stop in the kill zone, and the job is to get out of the kill zone and continue moving.
You should be teaching classes, sir.
I wouldn't go that far, but thank you. But I also note as well that one of the things that I find fascinating about the journey for people to Vietnam and to their unit's location is that there wasn't necessarily always somebody to direct you and say, hey, this is the next flight to Khe Sanh. In many ways, like you had to hitchhike your way piece by piece there and just use the intuition that was instilled in you.
A lot of planning goes into, plan A, B, and C for any particular mission where you've got any group of men, 5 men, 6 men up to, battalion size operation. All of that's planned very much so, but when you get down to the individual level, more often than not, you end up in a situation that I was in. And of course, one of the big problems was being extremely new. I mean, this is my second day in country, Vietnam, and a lot of emotional dynamics, fear, trepidation, just almost a matter of putting one foot in front of the other. Didn't worry about a lot about what could happen. Was pretty much more focused on just trying to be very aware, very much astute.
Well, and I know for you as well, second day in country, you also have an interesting incident with some fluorescent paint at Dong Ha that probably gave you more anxiety than was necessary.
Yes, sir. I was wondering if you're going to bring that up. We arrived Dong Ha pretty close to mid-afternoon, or excuse me, probably around 2 or 3 hours before dark. And of course, they were unloading supplies and things of that nature. And there were some other men that had been transported up. Uh, I found somebody who looked like they were in charge, told them that I had orders to get up to Khe Sanh, and they said this is the way to do it. And the guy told me that the next morning there'd be a helicopter leaving for Khe Sanh, and he put me on that. So for that night, I had no place to stay, and I asked him, "What do you want me to do?" And he says, "Well, we got a supply tent over there. You can go sleep in there." So I made my way over to this supply area and making me a little bed down on the ground there with my black jacket and helmet and stuff. And I accidentally bumped into a wooden crate that had a 1 gallon can of yellow fluorescent paint that somebody didn't put the lid on too tightly, about half full, I guess, and it kind of knocked it over and spilled this paint on my flak jacket. Fluorescent paints designed to show up in the dark, and it was all over the left panel of my flak jacket. So I was thinking that's not a good sign. And what happened with that? Yeah, I just now saw that you put a picture up there, and you can see some of the yellow paint that's still on the flak jacket. I grabbed a handful of dirt and smeared it around as best I could. And I had the opportunity at Khe Sanh a couple of times, because of men that were killed, things of that nature. I could have got me a new black jacket, but kind of felt, I don't want to say it was cocky, but I said, if I can make it this far, I'm not going to put this out there for anybody else to scavenge through. So that's the story of the yellow fluorescent paint on my flak jacket. By then, I think I'm into my third day in country.
I'm sure if there is a warehouse somewhere filled of flak jackets from Vietnam, there is one in there that probably still has this fluorescent paint still there.
I have no doubt.
Well, and I know too that your first couple of days in country are in a few ways, just kind of exhilarating and I'm sure exhausting at the same time of just how quickly you are moving across South Vietnam to eventually reach your assignment. Um, because I know when I'm curious too, being that you were at Dong Ha, you've got the fluorescent paint. Did you sleep much that night there, knowing you were going to Khe Sanh the next morning?
None at all. I was pretty exhausted. Um, by the time it was getting about sundown by the time I went in, got up and was awakened next morning. Um, Loud sound of bells ringing, almost like kind of a warning type bells. Obviously didn't know what was going on. Jumped up, got ready, and went out. I knew I was told to report for the helicopter early on, and they knew where I was at, so they were going to come get me anyhow. But I didn't get a chance to. I have no idea what Dung Ha looked like, other than just a matter of probably 100 yards square of where I ended up staying that one night.
Well, and I know with that first night at Doncaster, the next morning you mentioned the bells, and there's a fire. In your memoir, you, as you say, politely put it, but the shitter that was being burned had started a fire, and I know I've talked to several Marines, most of who at some point got the shit detail list, literally at some point of
Yeah.
burning the shitters. I actually know a Marine, if you want to talk to him sometime, who blew up one of these shitters as he was leaving country because he wanted to test a theory. Um, but did you ever have the duty of burning the shitters while you were in country?
Of course I did. You
And
know, I was
how
a
would you
private.
describe that duty to someone who has never been in the Marine Corps and done a shit burning detail?
Uh, CBs generally, if you were in a place like Khe Sanh, other arrangements had to be made if you're out in the field. But basically, if you think in terms of the old-timey outhouses, little simple wood frame type building, and you would have a one hole, two hole, sometimes a three holer, depending on how large the base was. And each one of these would have take a 55-gallon can drum that cut it in half. That would go underneath the seating area in the shitter with a little bit of diesel fuel in it. And that was to kind of keep the flight control in there a little bit better. So you'd go in and do your business all day long. And the next morning, one of the first duties for some poor private was to get assigned to burn the shitter detail. So you go out, and what we would do is there's a lot of empty sandbags around, things like that. So you just grab a sandbag and grab hold of the rim of that 55-gallon drum, pull it out the backside, pour some more diesel fuel on it, and light that afire, and it'd burn up all the shit. And then you put in a new, fresh little layer, put it back in, and you've done your duty. Very creative.
So, for that morning you wake up, did you ever know the full story of the fire that spread from the shitter?
I did find out while I was waiting for the helicopter that's what it was, because I asked, what was all the commotion about and everything, and the guy said, well, there's a fire, somebody was burning the shitter. At that point, that didn't mean anything to me. I'd never burned a shitter, so I didn't know what it was all about or anything. So I kind of thought, okay, cool. I says, the guy who was talking to me knew the story, and evidently some other poor private, probably a very new guy like me, was told, to go burn the shitters. So he went and burned the whole little outhouse thing down, thinking that's what he was supposed to do. And not exactly sure how that went over. I never found out what happened to him, but I suspect that unless he was just being really sarcastic and had an attitude and he was kind of getting back at authority, that he probably just went and did what some sergeant or somebody had told him to do.
And if you think about it, what's the worst they're going to do to him for a punishment? Send him to Vietnam?
Yeah. You heard that a lot in Vietnam, you know. It's also, when I tell people that's when I discovered the meaning of or the phrase, that came out of it is, being on the shit detail. I didn't know there was actually physically a thing like that.
Well, while we're on it, and before we jump, I wouldn't say jump, before we continue on into your journey to Khe Sanh, what were some other familiar phrases and slang words being used at this time while you were in country with 2-1?
The there's probably a whole list of them. I think one of them would be, humping. When they talked about, I was a radio operator, so when you go out in the field and you're going cross country wise, you're on a some kind of a checkpoint mission of some kind, going from point A to point B and stuff. Then you have your humping. So whatever you're carrying is the humping. So as a radio operator, when I got ready to go out in the field, I would have my backpack with me with the radio, PRC 25 radio. Always carried an extra battery with me. Radio operators also carried a incendiary grenade. If we were going to be overrun or anything like that out in the field, our job was the last thing was to burn up the radio. Incendiary grenade quite literally could burn through a block of a engine block of a Jeep in just a matter of 30 seconds or so.
Wow.
So, a little aside to that was that the problem is that the chemicals in the grenade ignite when exposed to air, oxygen. So if you're carrying one of those and a piece of shrapnel from an explosion goes through that canister, it can ignite it. So here you're walking around with basically like a little firebomb on your backpack and ready to take it off if you need to rapidly, but that's humping. Other guys would be humping the M60 machine gun. If you had any kind of a large size group of probably at least 15 guys or so, 20, usually you'd have a machine gunner and his assistant machine gunner. Assistant machine gunners carrying some of the extra ammo, machine gunners carrying the M60 machine gun. So they're humping that. Um, as a collective group, humping was that you're moving across the terrain from one place to another. It had nothing to do with, dogs and things of that nature, humping. But another word, I guess, there's obviously a whole vocabulary that went along with, ready operator kind of thing. You would have, like a mission. Everybody before they left an area, you were on a mission. And it was explained to you what you were going to be doing, where you were going to be going, who was going to be doing what. It was game plan type thing. And as a radio operator, the checkpoints, the officer would have a map and he knew that he was supposed to go from point A to point B, point C, etc. And the reason for that is that as a radar operator, I'd go out and I would be calling in that we'd made it to checkpoint A, for example. Our artillery support for that mission would also have that same information, radio communicated back to them. So they would be having their artillery track with us so that if the proverbial shit hit the fan and we had to call in fire support, they wouldn't have to, spend time cranking artillery around to get to our position. The mechanics of just a simple little mission like that um, involve many, many different layers, very complicated, lots of danger involved because, if you're firing artillery out, you want it to be close enough to you to be of any value, but not so close that you have friendly fire and casualties. Um, I'm having difficulty coming up thinking of terms of other terms or phrases that was somewhat unique. Uh, I think that, oh, I was kind of shocked when I first got there that almost everybody, and I didn't know there were so many derivatives of the simple word fuck, fucker, fucking, et cetera, et cetera. Almost every sentence communicated to anybody at any time, had that word in there. And I never really cussed or anything. And I picked up the habit, when I was in Vietnam and stuff. And um, embarrassed to say that when I actually made it home and leave afterwards, and stuff, my mom was talking to me, I still slipped into that old habit. And she gave me that look like, huh? That's not my son. So I broke that habit eventually in life there, but it was if you think about it, about the only people you're talking to is other Marines, and other people you didn't know the language, so vocabulary changed a lot and it was simplified in many ways.
And I think you find a lot of good representation of that in some of the more honest memoirs about Vietnam, written by Marines who use the language that was spoken because you're right, it's every other word. Because the vocabulary expands, but it's also, as you say, the word fuck is used in many ways to describe what situation you could be in, good or bad,
Yeah.
because it is so versatile and it's a form of expression and it's an expression that's acceptable and it's common even in today's military and well before Vietnam.
So definitely been the case. And it's interesting for me, and I'm thinking about it now in just kind of a hindsight sort of way about, you know, it's a whole new culture, whole new environment, and a lot of the social external controls aren't there. And I think that's part of the reason, thinking about it in terms of when Marines or when combat people come back into the United States, their whole perspective of normal has been changed. You went to Vietnam as a normal American kid, basically. You experienced all kinds of reality that you weren't prepared for. And then you come back home and you still have that reality with you. So a lot of the dynamics and things that went into um, the homecoming experience for, especially I think for Vietnam veterans, was made difficult because of that change. If you think in terms of old men or young men go to war and old men come home, you come home looking like a young man and you're blending with all your buddies and young men that you'd left behind, but you're in that group as an ancient person. And there's things that, I know in my case, I kept a lot of when the guys would ask me what it was that I experienced in Vietnam, I gave them the kind of little, very vanilla feedback. I didn't want to have them dealing with a lot of what I had seen and a lot of what I had done. I didn't want to bust their bubble. And you have that sense of alienation with all the people around you. And that's kind of one of the after effects of that. And such is the nature of war.
Absolutely, it is. And that nature of war was very quick for your introduction to Vietnam because I understand that your flight into Khe Sanh, as soon as the bird was in the process of rotating and throwing out mail bags and you jumped out of the helicopter, you've got incoming, and that's your introduction to Khe Sanh.
I actually was being shot at. If you count the fact that I was inside of the helicopter, they were shooting at the helicopter. Um, but um, to actually be targeted coming in and knowing that I didn't know until the last minute that the helicopter wasn't even going to land because it was too dangerous to be a setting target. So they came in backwards and dumped the mail bags out of the back of the helicopter and told me to jump on the mail bags. So it was about roughly a 9 to 10 foot leap that I took, landing on these really soft mail bags. And on my way out the back of the helicopter, I yelled at the loadmaster there. I said, "Where do I go?" Because here again, I've been hitchhiking my way up to Khe Sanh. I've arrived at Khe Sanh, but now where do I go when I'm there? Never knew until I got there. I said, "Where do I go? Where do I go?" I thought they'd at least tell me where to check in at or something. It was just, they were the taxi driver, drop you off and they're out of there. So yeah, run to the nearest bunker. That created a little bit of a problem in itself too, because I didn't know what a bunker was. You know, if I'd been in country for probably 5 or 6 days, even before I went to Khe Sanh, I probably would have come across the term bunker. I had a better idea what it was. My idea of a bunker, anything close to that was the old World War II type of thing that you see on movies and stuff, but I didn't know that for sure. So I took off running for, I don't know if you want to go into the cute little story about the panic that I was in hitting the ground.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's kind of, I'll frame it by saying, keep in mind, here's this little West Texas kid jumps off the back of this helicopter at Khe Sanh with artillery rounds coming in. For me, they sounded close. I didn't know by Khe Sanh standards that they were actually hitting pretty good little distance away from where I was at, but they sounded close to me. So I heard the explosion off to my right, so I veered to my left and started running. Heard another explosion off to my right, kept turning to my left, and all of a sudden I looked up and I saw the mailbags in front of me. So here was this stupid little Marine running around in circles on the airstrip at Khe Sanh, running for a bunker, not knowing what a bunker was. And that's when I just said, the heck with it, and found a straight line closest to, off from the runway. Took off running and saw a big pile of sandbags there with a little opening in them, and then jumped in there. And it was there where I met, there was four other Marines in that little bunker there. Found out later that a lot of, they were right there close to the airstrip, and their main job was to kind of run out and get cargo and any supplies that were able to make it in by air. So that was part of their detail there. And so they told me where the command bunker was and where I would check in and let the battalion know that I'd arrived and go from there.
Well, and I understand with you diving into that bunker and one of these Marines in there looks at you and just goes, "New guy," and or if something of that nature. And in many ways, it's comical because that does seem like a comical cartoon that you would see about people trying to find the gallows humor of the arrival at Khe Sanh.
It's exactly what it was. If when I was writing my memoir, I had to make some decisions. I'm writing to an unknown audience of the future. Um, I knew I was going to share the memoir with family members that were interested, things of that nature, but also had a very fond appreciation of history, even before I went to Vietnam. So when I decided that I was going to go ahead and go through the somewhat painful process of re-experiencing my Vietnam life by writing it down, I have a tremendous sense of humor to start with, and it was easier for me to put little snippets of that type of reality that was there also, and it helped balance out, some of what I ended up having to talk about that was uh, the ugly part of war. If it was just a focus on all the bad parts of war, I probably wouldn't have been able to write it. And you make do with what you got, and you know you're growing up. You grow up fast in combat if you live long enough.
That's a poignant and honest but all too true statement. I mean, I think the average age of a Marine in Vietnam was something between 21, 22 years old. And I think about myself at 21 and 22 and what I was doing. I was still a kid. I was partying in college. Um, I was still making teenage decisions, I guess in many ways, and young decisions. I was not a man. I was not grown. Um, and I can only imagine the parallel there to what you experience. You're taking incoming in country, your third day there. Meanwhile, back in the United States, someone your age is partying, perhaps. Someone your age is just walking down the street in the United States, back in the world, and yet here you are hoping you survive the next 13 months.
Um, Actually, all of that's very true, but you're not worrying about 2 months. You're worrying about the next day. You know, uh, every day. that you woke up, if you were really grounded into reality like I was, you knew it could be your last day. And that's not how everybody took it. There's other people. There is something they call the Superman syndrome. And the Superman syndrome is, the young guy that believes that he's too young to die, he's too lucky, whatever. It's part of a defense mechanism, kind of keep him moving in that environment. And it can cause you to do some really pretty unhealthy things in combat. You know, you jump up to charge enemy fire when you don't have to, because you've got this concept in your head that you're going to make it. You've lied to yourself. I call it lying to yourself. That, yeah, I can be in a dangerous, bad place, and yes, there's people around me getting killed, but not me. And I took it the other direction when I arrived at Khe Sanh. As a matter of fact, pretty rapidly, just kind of said to myself, you're a goner. You're out of here. You're not going to make it. And I think for the way I ended up basically being thrown into that reality of daily incoming siege-like conditions where you had to live underground in bunkers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's either one way or the other. You can't just maintain a neutral position. And as long as I said, if this is my last day, I'm going to make sure I do the best job I can of being a part of that team. This is Marine Corps conditioning again, team of people trying to accomplish a mission, knowing that there's going to be casualties. So you have to assume that you're going to be that casualty or not. And I think that's why I have such a fascination and respect for the word reality. I think the sooner you can get both feet on the ground of reality, and I'm not talking about quotes of reality, the better chances of surviving you're going to have.
Well,
So,
and I know for you and for your memoir, that this is the 21st of April. You've been at Case on a few hours, and you see that reality within your arrival there as a transfer to the Commo Platoon was hit with shrapnel as were in the process of moving to, if I'm not mistaken, your living quarters when incoming came and people began to scatter.
yes, sir, that was probably I can count it as my very first real experience of what I could expect at Khe Sanh. I'd been on the ground there at Khe Sanh probably for about an hour, maybe, by the time I jumped off the helicopter and made my way to command bunker, checked in there, made my way to the comm platoon area. And there's a sergeant that met me there, who was the radio chief guy. Checked in with him. He had pointed out a little four-man, technically a five-man, but think of it as a four-man sized bunker that was in that comm area that I would be going to as my home while I was there at Khe Sanh. So I hadn't even unloaded my stuff, which by the way I didn't have any stuff. It's not like I'm traveling with a sea bag or anything of that nature. I had my rifle, my flak jacket, my helmet, my ammunition, and that's what I had when I jumped onto the mailbags. So I'm checking in there, and there's a high screeching sound, almost like a whistling type sound. and everybody scattered. I tell people is like, if you ever get up at night and you turn on the lights and all the cockroaches scatter, try to find their hiding places. Everybody scattered, and I didn't know what was going on, but when everybody else started running, I started running. And people were trying to get into the bunkers there, and just a very few, probably about, in reality, about 2 seconds after hearing that sound, what I was hearing was incoming round. And 2 seconds after hearing the screeching sound, there's a loud explosion. Um, I knew instantly it was a very close explosion because it was very different than the explosions that I'd heard when I was landing. And certainly by everybody else's reaction, I had made it into the bunker. I was about, I wasn't the last one in the bunker. I was learning real fast here, but we waited it out. There wasn't any other explosions. I learned later it was just a harassing round. Um, you know, the bad guys were up in the hills there and they were so far away, they couldn't really target you well. Think of it just lobbing, rounds into a large bullseye and you're going to hit some things sometimes and miss a lot of things. But there's always a lot of shrapnel flying around in the air. And coming out of that bunker after this one single rocket hit, a lot of the guys were cussing, and I said I knew something bad, was there. And as I came out, there's a guy laying face down on the ground there, and a kid unfortunately caught a pretty good sized piece of shrapnel that had hit him right in the back and opened him up, pretty much like a watermelon had been burst. And that was the very first dead person that I saw about, hour and a half after I got to Khe Sanh. That didn't do a lot to reinforce my comfort level of, when I was telling myself flying up to Khe Sanh that, it's not gonna be too bad. I'm gonna make it. That all went to shit pretty quickly. So the guys that had been there for a while, they went into their unfortunate normal routine of getting the body back down to the battalion aid station into a body bag, ready to go out on a medevac to get returned to the morgue there in Da Nang. And I went and introduced myself to the couple of guys that were in my new bunker. Saving grace of that is somebody had the foresight to put, there's 5 of us assigned to that bunker. It could hold comfortably, if you think of a small space being comfortable, but all there's 4 of us from Texas and one guy was from Georgia. Usually there'd only be 4 of us in there because one would be on radio watch, type thing. So I was in a little 4-man bunker with 4 other Texans, and that became my home for the next 3 months.
With you being the F&G, the boot, the replacement, how did some of these guys that had been there, maybe just weeks or even months, or for an extended period of time, take to someone new coming into the unit? Were they friendly or were they kind of quiet, stiff, and cold-shouldered?
For the most part, it had a lot to do with how long the person had been in country. I'm not going to go through the long detailed story about how our government, the military, had decided that to reduce the amount of mental health casualties in combat, especially after World War II, Korea, there was a plan that implemented to do combat differently. And it involved replacing individuals with what was called a tour of duty. Prior to that, units would train together, units would go into a combat environment, units would leave that environment. And of course, you'd have casualties during that time, and those casualties would be replaced by new guys. That's just the mechanism of combat. With the change in Vietnam, with individuals replacing individuals, then you knew you had in the Marine Corps, you had 13 months that you were going to be in Vietnam. So you had this little calendar in your head ticking off that one day down, 380 something to go. And you've got people out of that five guys that were in our bunker, one of them was a short timer. You talk about vocabulary. Short timer is a guy that's usually down to his last month. Could be wasn't a specific number, but he was getting close to the end of his tour. So he's on his way out. He's not going to make a big emotional attachment to a new guy coming in. Um, the guys that had been there for a little bit longer, they, if they came in more or less the same time period, more or less had the same number of months in country, depending on their own personalities, they may have, guys that they got a little close to and whatnot. But for the most part, you didn't want to get really close to a new guy because they were dangerous. They didn't know. They didn't know how to work as a integrated team in that reality environment. So new guys were dangerous. And also, it showed up in nicknames. Hardly anybody called anybody by their name. And I think it was looking back at it, I think it was a psychological thing, about nickname. My last name is Gordon, so somebody named me Flash, and it didn't have anything to do with uh, Flash um, being fast. It was Flash Gordon, the old back then old spaceship guy, you know. So another guy that was in our communication platoon was Escondino Eddie because he was from Escondino, California. So people had nicknames. And if you knew somebody by name, that meant you were getting closer to them. And if the next day he was somebody you were putting in a body bag, it hurt that much more. So you get this really odd, strange kind of culture where you had people that were really, really close, very dependent on each other, but also this separation. And it would take probably hours, to kind of describe how you get from point A to point B to going home in that whole kind of environment.
Well, in that environment, and in this close living proximity that you share in this bunker, because this is your life for what, the next 3 months, where you're living in this bunker approximately at Khe Sanh. And to take another photograph from your memoir, this
Huh.
is an idea on the inside. So how do you make this place homey? How do you take the inside of a bunker and try to make it resemble some sort of normalcy if it's possible?
The first thing I'm going to say, there's always the pinup girls, Playboy pinup pictures inside. That's classic longtime military, fantasy, I think. The particular bunker that I'm looking at now and the guys in there, you know, there's a fellow on the right that I recognize. No, I remember the face of the guy on the left, just as an aside on this particular um, picture. He was I think, a relatively short timer. He wasn't with the battalion much longer after I got there. The bunker inside of this bunker here is one of the larger bunkers. You can tell right away because it's got a support beam where one of the utility shirts is hanging on. Some of the bunkers hanging down from the rafters, or some of the sleeping racks. On the left-hand side, you see um, that's a stretcher that has the cords on it to hold it up, and there's a stretcher like the one that the two guys are sitting on that's right underneath there. So that's how you could crowd a good little bit of people into the bunker. The bunker that I lived in would have been about, like, for one thing, it wasn't as tall. The height wasn't as much in my bunker. You had to walk around in our bunker stooped over. You couldn't stand up straight. And we had four cots in there, one cot by itself, and then on the sides at the back of our bunker, we had four, being the bunk bed type that you see on the left-hand side of the picture. And you had a little bit of space, about maybe 2 feet in between those. So there wasn't any decorating really to do inside of our little small four-man bunker. Um, it was just you didn't have a table to write on. I mean, it was where you slept, and it was what where you went if you had incoming rounds. If you were around that area, you always stayed close to your bunker. Down the road here, I can probably tell you a story about sitting right outside of my bunker, and there should be a picture of me there where I'm sitting on what's called a blast wall. But we can save that story for some other time. But it was one of the near misses that I experienced at Khe Sanh. But decorating was not really much of what was going on at the time.
I'm sure, most definitely. And I know that at the start of this conversation, you mentioned the pinups, and I know in this photograph, I'm pretty sure I can see a few pinups in the background of this. When you were in country and at your time at Khe Sanh, did you receive any mail from home or any packages that you would share with the guys that in your bunker? Is that common practice?
That would be common practice, very much so. The One of the neat things that came out of that experience, with the other guys there in Vietnam, was because other people had been there longer than you were, they had girlfriends or people they were writing to. And I ended up writing to a young lady who was a friend of one of the guys in my bunker. It was his girlfriend had a girlfriend, and she wanted to write to somebody. So um, I gave him my name to give to her, and her name was Jeannie. And Jenny and I started a letter two-way combination all the way through my first tour there. Pretty much, I think all this, I think I got introduced to Jenny about my second month at Khe Sanh. So I was still at Khe Sanh. So pretty much all of my first tour. And we'll have plenty of opportunities to talk about later because, again, I'm still in contact with her. She's married. Her mother is still alive, and I'm still in communication with them. They've been part of my life ever since. So you had that dynamic that could take place. A lot of my old girlfriends back home, or the girls that were in high school, I didn't have really any one particular girlfriend. I knew girls, and they were wanting to write, and some of them would start out writing early on, but dropped off later. It's but yes, there's a lot of that kind of sharing. Packages would get mailed in. Um, the big requests that people would write home for and might get delivered would be, believe it or not, Tabasco sauce. A lot of the C rations that we were eating, we lived off from C rations and occasionally some B rations for the full 3 months that we were at Khe Sanh. And there's only 12 meals to a case of C rations, so you got pretty tired of eating the same old, and some of it didn't really taste all that good. Made to be nutritious, but not necessarily good tasting. So if somebody got mailed a bottle of Tabasco sauce that made it through, then if you put enough Tabasco sauce on some of the meals there, that made them palatable. Every once in a while, somebody would be able to sneak in a bottle of booze. Um, I remember one time at Khe Sanh, a guy got his brother had sent him a plastic bottle of Listerine, and when he opened it up, we were thinking, Listerine. What are you worried about bad breath? Well, what his brother did is they put gin in it and the plastic bottle just to keep it from getting broke or whatever, and it made it all the way through the military customs and whatnot. So we were sitting around with a bottle of gin in our bunker, and the problem was, no ice. What are you going to do with bottle of gin? And I'm going to make a recommendation to you that if anybody offers you a grape Kool-Aid and gin drink, I'd pass because that's what we did to handle the gin. And of course, after a couple of those, you didn't need the grape Kool-Aid anymore. So adapt and overcome, Marine Corps slogan.
Marine Corps mindset from young tenacious Marines.
Yeah.
Well, in thinking about this in many ways, it's interesting, Gary, to think about the connections that you made in 1968 that you still have today, with your CO, with the family, the fact that you were writing to various people, and yet somehow you are still in contact with them in 2024. It's incredible to think about the bonds that were formed that maybe you didn't realize at the time and the impact. And it's like, were any of those letters ever kept? Did you ever get to see or any of those original letters that you wrote back in 1968?
I am extremely fortunate that my mother kept what turned out to be about two shoebox full of my mail
Wow.
that I'd sent home. And I didn't know that until she passed away and I was cleaning out her apartment that he lived in. and found the box of stuff there and found those letters. And it was very interesting for me and very helpful when I started writing my memoir, pen down some dates on some things because I went back and reread those letters and I was talking about some things that, had taken place and things of that nature, and never went into the kind of details that you would want your mother to hear about. Um, a quick little aside story with that. Three three of the letters that were in the mail there, about a third of the letters was kind of torn and shredded. And these were letters that I'd sent home from Khe Sanh shortly after I got or arrived at Khe Sanh. And I never knew this until I got home because those three letters had been put in a government envelope and mailed to my mother, and no explanation or anything. On the outside of that government brown envelope, it said damaged in transport. What had happened is that, these are three letters that I had written, but I wasn't able to get them out into the mail run of a helicopter coming in and taking mail out. So they accumulated, they were all together. And the helicopter that was flying that mail out was shot down. And these three letters, along with others, were damaged or destroyed. So whoever was in charge of all that put them in this brown envelope. In one of those letters, I'm talking to my mother about, don't worry about me, it's not too bad here. And she's reading the letter, trying to read as much of it as she can from a messed up, torn letter, that got shot down in a helicopter. So if the mail can't even make it out of there safe, and this is where her son is, and she never told me about it, the damage part of it, until I found them, actually. Didn't even know
Well,
about that.
in many ways, it's the irony that you're trying to protect your mom and have her not worry in many ways or try to prevent that, but also to try to put, I guess, part of her mind at ease. And yet, even through your attempt to do that, fate and enemy incoming fire got in the way of that. And it would have been interesting to know your mom's reaction to reading this burnt, twisted, torn letter.
It would have been, and I'm sure she was doing the countermeasure of what I was doing, is just trying to not throw anything into the fire to make me worry more. I was already concerned about that and stuff. So, and as a continuation of your previous question, I was going to say that this isn't a new thought of mine. I've had this theory for ages now, but Jenny, the girl that I was writing, a lot of times I would write my letters when I was on night watch in a command bunker. It was usually a more peaceful time. If there's any night activity going on, like a night ambush with one of the companies out around us or something like that, then obviously things would be pretty hectic and bang, bang real quick, but it was cut and dry usually. Didn't prolong over a period of hours. So a lot of the time on radio watch, I was monitoring probably about four different radios, but not a lot of traffic going on. So that's when I would write my letters and do some other writings and stuff. Tried my hand at writing some poems or something that just inspirational things. But if you're writing, I was writing a letter. Here's the mindset. I'm writing a letter to a person I've never met. She did send me a picture. Obviously, that's what went along with letters and stuff. But you're also writing a letter to somebody that you don't know if you're ever going to meet. you don't know if you're going to live long enough to even have a chance to meet them. And I was fortunate enough to have a young girl that hung in there with me because I think that you can get into some very deep male back and forth conversations with somebody that you don't know, that you've grown to trust and feel comfortable with, but you're also kind of sharing with them thoughts and things that you don't have an external social context to keep you from being more honest. And if that makes any sense to you,
It does.
it's a different format of letter writing when it's in that type of environment.
Do you possibly credit her and this pen pal friendship with perhaps giving you some relief, giving you a boost in morale, or just giving you a break from some of the letters you had to write to your mother where you kind of like try to sugarcoat or cover things up?
It was extremely that way. Yeah. And, most of the guys that I knew back home, the ones that I'd played football, ran track with, for example, we didn't really communicate by mail. Men don't do that, stuff. And they had their lives. They were out, you know, some of them going to college and whatnot and stuff. And um, later on in my memoirs, I talk about, my first coming home after I survived my first tour of Vietnam and going home on leave, 30-day leave, and actually, you know, came back early because things had just changed in that 1 year, basically so much. But with Jenny and her family, and again, she had two brothers. I got to know the whole family, you know. Her parents were very accepting of her writing to a Marine in Vietnam back when Marines in Vietnam weren't real popular. Um, so it's tremendous uplifting kinds of stuff. Um, and there's more, if we're graced with enough time to be able to kind of go through the whole memoir, there's an area in there that I dedicate as kind of the thoughts after the two tours that I did in terms of how important that was for my own sanity. And I contribute a lot of that to my um, survival post Vietnam. Um, I can get teary eyed just thinking about how important that was and
Well,
not
and
knowing it at the time.
I was going to ask too, and I'm glad you brought it up, because yes, we are going to definitely take the time over the next several months to deep dive through this memoir. But I was going to ask if there was a portion of this that does go back to Jenny and the relief that she gave you, and hopefully, I hope Jenny does end up get to see these interviews to still know the importance that she still holds, to something that's almost what, 60 years later. We're looking at 56 years.
Yeah. Mhm.
And with that being said, of availability, because I'm on Christmas break, are you free Tuesday, Gary?
Just so happens that the calendar that I hang in the pantry is right here with me. Let me check. Um,
And if not Tuesday, I'm available tomorrow evening. I just don't know exactly when I'll be home. I have to take my grandmother to a doctor's appointment tomorrow.
yeah. Um, Tomorrow, I'm available tomorrow. I'll need to be gone, but we can schedule around that for about maybe 2 hours. And that's not set in time yet. Um, Tuesday, I would have Tuesday afternoon probably available. Say sometime after 1 p.m. or so.
I'm good both days. If we want to do a hard set on Tuesday around 1 p.m. and then tomorrow we can play it by ear for the flexibility for you, and we can do two sessions tomorrow because I know we still have a big chunk of the first few weeks at Khe Sanh to go through with that memoir that we haven't deep dived into yet, and I definitely want to spend time talking about that over the next couple of days.
I can guarantee you that the my 3 months at Khe Sanh probably makes up the bulk of my memoir. That's the critical part, and the rest of my Marine Corps history, the second tour, things of that nature, all have their own little dynamics and stuff. But there's the expression you were talking about vocabulary, and there was a term called RAMP, and it was an acronym.
Rear echelon
R,
motherfucker.
yeah, rear echelon. So, you know, I ended up, long story, and we'll get into it. I did 2 tours in Vietnam, separated by about almost 10 months, 9 months. Um, the first tour I tell people was my combat tour. My second tour ended up being a REMF tour, rear echelon. And that is a Vietnam story that's a complement to the combat part. And I'm glad I went through the combat first part. I'm extremely grateful, hindsight wise, that I started out my Vietnam combat tour at Khe Sanh because anything after Khe Sanh was not as bad as Khe Sanh. Nothing happened after Khe Sanh that equaled anything I experienced during that first 3 months. And I experienced a good little bit after Khe Sanh too. There's some stuff that I got involved with, but a battalion ready operator was a little bit better off, I should say a lot better off, than a ready operator that was assigned to a company who's humping radio for maybe a lieutenant or a captain, for example. As a matter of fact, a lot of their ready operators were um, not school trained ready operators. They would just be somebody they kind of felt had enough intellect to be able to handle the job and that sort of thing. And next man standing, got to be the ready operator. And
I'm
of course,
working with
that
another
was,
case on veteran who was with Charlie Company 19,
yeah,
and he was in 0311, arrived in country, and he was given a radio, no training on it, operated at the platoon level.
yep. And I always made sure that when I was out on any kind of operation with anybody, I always made sure there was at least one other guy with me that knew how to call in medevacs because I might be the medevac.
That's true.
And I didn't like the thought of sitting there trying to, be shot up or something like that and or unconscious and have to have somebody not know at least the basics of what to do there.
And if you don't know the basics, that is the difference in life or death for a medevac bird you're trying to get into an LZ.
Yeah. So sounds good. Let me make a note to myself here. 1 o'clock Tuesday.
Yes, sir.